the question of the Labour Party. I mean, there's a real problem if you're breathing down the Labour Party's neck summer. I suspect it makes for sort of tensions. All I'd say is I have a very good working relationship with Catherine Webb, and I think they have done some very good things, actually. But the transport strategy will be set by City Hall, and we won't be funding any borough, whatever their political complexion, that's working in a contrary direction to that. I want to see a huge shift away from car usage into cycling and walking and public transport, and everything we do will be geared in that direction. And so, you know, I mean, I've got so many rows for the Labour Party. I mean, why pick on any one? For God's sake, they threw me out. And it's quite, I mean, if you've heard Ed Miliband, he said when asked, well, what Andy Kennedy does that you don't like, well, nothing you can do about that, he's been doing it in all his life. And then what Constantine said about private tenants. I mean, I want the mayor to have the sort of powers that local government had when I first got involved in the 70s. If a landlord wanted to increase their rent, they had to go to a rent tribunal, an independent body, and that was a good way of capping rents. We had really strong environmental, what they called public health inspectors in those days, teams in boroughs that went out and pursued bad landlords and prosecuted them. When I was the vice chair of housing in Lambeth and the chair of housing in Camden, at the opposite ends of this decade, the 70s, we put compulsory purchase orders on thousands of private rented properties where the landlords were not looking after them properly or leaving properties empty. We drove bad landlords up this. Now, we haven't quite got those powers, sadly. That's why we're setting up a mayor's lettings agency to undermine their rip-off charges, because someone like Foxton's charges 11% of the year's rent to actually introduce someone who wants to rent to someone who's renting. And then they charge 11% in every subsequent year. That is outrageous, and I think we could get that down to at least half that and reduce the rents. I then want to actually have a campaign against bad landlords, and what I'd want is something like the German code for how private landlords should operate. But you've got to bring down the rents, and part of the reason rents have soared and house prices have soared is we haven't been building enough decent homes for people to rent. This nonsense that one day everyone will own their own home is just that. We need something much more like France and Germany, where there's perhaps a 50-50 balance between renting and purchasing. And that's why I'm also committed to a major house building programme of homes for rent at affordable rents. But this is going to be a huge struggle. Croydon Council is proposing that its homeless families move to Hull because it's cheaper to house them there. We will be in the courts challenging bad things, bad landlords, and putting compulsory purchase orders on those properties which bad landlords neglected, and driving this agenda, this issue up the political agenda, because I think it should be up there as it used to be until Thatcher got in and put all of this into reverse.
Thanks. And in terms of affordable rents, will you do what you did with the London Living Wage and actually have City Hall set a recommended level for an affordable rent that you can use in negotiations with social housing providers as the housing authority for London, and that you can use as a benchmark to put pressure on all landlords across London?
At the moment we're saying no one should pay more than a third of their income in rent. That's still very high. And so I think it's a good idea to get in an independent economist to make some sort of assessment about what this should be. But if they want anything more than a third, I might not agree with their report. I'm looking for something that might be below that.
Okay, we will move on to another round of questions then. So I saw Elliot first, and then Jim at the back, and then Daniel. So Elliot.
Recently you said you'd like the National Health Service to devolve to the GLA. What other powers would you like to see devolved to the mayor? Obviously you've mentioned some already, so I'd like to know what others you think you should do.
Okay, good. And then who was next? Jim was next.
I've got a question about the financial sector. I think in London the financial sector has been one of the most deregulated and pampered sectors of the economy. I think at the moment the bonuses, stuff about bankers' bonuses and all the rest of it, is very much a sideshow in terms of the actual harm that the financial sector and the banking industry has done to the global economy. I'm slightly concerned about your record in terms of essentially favouring the financial sector and trying to make London a kind of centralised hub of that sector across Europe and across the world. I'd like to hear, without talking about bonuses, I'd like to hear what you thought you would do to regulate that industry.
Good question. And Daniel?
In your last answer, you said that you wanted more people not to use the car, but to walk and to cycle instead. Can you give us some actual practical measures that you will adopt to achieve that?
Good, okay, 3 questions there. Devolution of powers from City Hall, your record with the financial sector in London, and walking and cycling.
Well, basically, I agree with that sort of second preference that the SNP's got, a Devo Max. I think, yeah, full independence of Scotland. I'm not certain really a nation of 5 million people wants to fund embassies all the way around the world, and frankly, even Germany isn't a real player on the international field, and European nations are not going to be major players in a world dominated by the rising new powers and declining old one in America. But everything below, military spending, foreign policy, and macroeconomic policy, I think should be devolved out. I mean, the Mayor of New York runs the health service, the schools, the benefit system, and basically everything that the citizen in New York wants. They know it comes out of City Hall, they know who's accountable. And if you look here, I mean, the benefit system should be something we devise. The benefit system that is geared to, a national average is completely thrown out of kilter by the fact everything, it costs 40% more to live in London. That's why, schemes that work quite well at getting people back into work and off benefits elsewhere don't work here. And nursery costs are completely off the wall. And even if you think about it, just the fact, nowhere else in Britain does it take so long for people to get to work. Because, you've got, the next biggest city's got 1 million people in Birmingham. And therefore all those sorts of things require, I think, a different London dimension. Also, I've watched Labour and Tory health secretaries for 30 years fail to actually manage properly London's health services and hospitals. I think you need that sort of area of coordination. The Mayor of New York also runs some of the prisons. I could think of a much more humane way of running our prisons than we've had over the last 30 years. So I want to devolve everything as much, and that's a principle I follow. I think there should be strong English regions and devolve stuff all down from Whitehall. Because we are the most centralised of all the Western democracies. When I told the Mayor of Moscow that 95% of all tax in Britain is collected by the Chancellor, he said, well, that's worse than Russia under Stalin. And it is. We're like, I would say we're like North Korea with an election every 4 or 5 years, know that. Even Cameron and Osborne aren't quite as mad as that regime. But it isn't too far from the old East Germany. On the financial set, I often said when I was talking to bankers, look, this isn't the world I would have created. But the very limited powers of the mayoralty, and they've been strengthened both by what this government's done on policing and what the last government did in my second term with a real raft of new powers on housing and so on coming. Powers that being, no powers really influence or determine those things. If we had an independent London, you'd have a very different strategy. If you see what I would do, if I'd been Chancellor at any point in the period of this, go onto the website Socialist Economic Bulletin, which I published from 1990 till I became mayor in 2000. If they followed my bloody advice, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. Because if you actually look, Germany's got unemployment half the level we have. They've kept a good, high-skilled manufacturing sector. They've kept an education system where kids who aren't going to university get a good technical education. And I think isn't just the way they handle their private tenants and landlords that a lot to learn from. There's a lot to learn from that country. Given the powers, I'd make a very different economic pattern in London, one in which the financial sector isn't predominant. And if you really want more detail, if you get my autobiography, which is now just out of paperback, you can't say that. I actually find that quite interesting. In the early 1890s in America, the American President Andrew Jackson was in a great struggle with the Bank of America. It dominated his presidency because he thought the financial sector was too strong, catastrophic recession and all that. And the Chief Justice at the time said, we must never again allow the banks to be too big to fail. Those are the exact bloody words. And what happens is every 50 years or so, there's or 60 years, some great banking disaster. Then there's good regulation. 30 years pass, everyone who went through it died. They start to relax it, we get it again. It's an absolute repetitive pattern. And therefore, give me the power, I'd really change it. I have to say, I don't think Osborne's going to do that.
Before we just move on to the next one, do you think you did do enough in your time as mayor to actually try and diversify London's
Oh,
economy?
we tried within the very limited powers that we got. And don't get against the background of a Labour government who assumed that the financial sector and its economic dynamism and profits would lift the whole economy and it all be trickled down.
Some of us were warning that
Yeah.
would come, that would fall apart
I've
at
got-
some stage. And we
I have
couldn't
got
rely on it.
30 years of warning that. I mean, going right 1983, the GLC proposed that we have a fibre optic cable system for the whole of Britain, linking every home and school and business. And we calculated you get 400,000 new jobs created on the back of the potential that creates. I mean, if we'd gone down that road, we'd be the leader in ICT and information technology. I mean, this would have been the nation that came up with Microsoft type enterprise and Steve Jobs type characters. And once again, we've lagged behind everywhere else. So I'm always in favour of, clearly now, given what's coming with climate change, we should be at the cutting edge of developing the new technologies, the things people will rush to buy when they realise we're desperately up against it. And if you want any doubt about where we all stand on the financial sector, look at who the financial sector are funding at this election. I mean, 80% of Boris's donations at the last election came from individual donations from hedge fund managers, property boutique owners and investment bankers. They had no doubt about which candidate was going to be most favourable to the city, and he's rewarded them by campaigning to cut the top rate of tax. And will no doubt carry on campaigning to cut it to 40% next year. And then on walking and cycling. Well, I suppose this is built into my DNA because I never learned to drive. I've lived all my life in the city. I walk. I use public transport. I've not cycled. The factor that I came up with in all this is that, on the assumption you're spending half an hour a day on bus or tube or train to get to work, and then half an hour back, that is 4 working weeks a year of reading time. In a working lifetime, it is 4 years. And this is the contrast. You get 4 years to read either for pleasure or as work, or do you sit in a bloody traffic jam fuming for 4 years? I think it's absolute madness, and therefore we'll do everything we can to make walking and cycling more attractive. I say Jenny will be given a reign of terror brief, to go through TfL, because we know what's happened. Boris has taken out the safety measures should have been put in. You go down to Bow Road Junction, it's terrifying. There's just no way to, forget cycling, no way to walk across it. You just have to climb over things and run. And we know that the local cycling groups work with TfL on that junction, and the things that were put in for safety for cyclists were taken out. When TfL went back to Johnston's office and said, you will put cyclists' lives at risk if you take this out, the then transport advisor called her and said, the mayor's priority is traffic flow, which is a euphemism for speed. And we will put those things back in. In actual fact, I expect with Jenny we'll go down to Bow Junction immediately after the election, see what can we do before the Olympics. Because I do not want, against the backdrop of the Olympics, on many of the roads where crossings are being taken out and all of this, that we celebrate the Olympics with an increase in the deaths of cyclists and pedestrians.
Thank you. Right, 3 more questions. So Martin will take, then Elizabeth just behind, and then Mike at the end.
Okay, Martin from Brent Fightback. My question really is what leadership you can show for the London boroughs, and the Labour London boroughs in particular, in fighting the government cuts. At the moment, we're faced with a Labour council, which is saying there is no alternative, which has closed half our libraries and is doing all sorts of other things as well. Is there an alternative, and what will you do about it?
Thank you. And next question.
Elizabeth Whitebird, Hackney. I'm definitely going to be voting for you for my second preference, and I have no doubt that that's the best thing to do for me as an individual. I'm quite concerned about the Green Party as a party endorsing the Labour candidate as a Labour candidate, and clearly from a lot of the things you've said, the things that you stand for are actually quite different to what we've seen from Labour over the last, 13 years of government and now in opposition. And I don't really know if there's anything you can say about that to kind of allay my concerns, but rather than talking about why we should endorse you, really why should we endorse Labour?
Good point. And then third question. Yeah.
For me?
Yeah.
You called me Mike, so I
Sorry,
got
sorry.
confused.
Yeah, sorry.
My name is Benny, I'm from Haringey. I was watching the BBC News channel on the night when the riots spread across London, and you were being interviewed, and one of the points you made at the time, which I think got blown up a bit at the time, was that there's a certain section of London's society which has no stake in society. And I was inclined to agree with that analysis, but I'm wondering what you might do as mayor to try to ensure a society that doesn't do what was many of us predicted last year, riot because of the gross inequality of the city.
Good. 3 questions there. So firstly, I can't even read my writing. Leadership on the cuts issue. Then, why should we endorse the Labour Party, not just endorse Ken Livingstone as a second preference? And riots and exclusion.
Well, I think if you look at fighting cuts, we all know that when Cameron is either pushed aside or is defeated at the election, the Tory succession will be between Osborne and Johnson. And therefore, Osborne would most likely have a real interest in me giving Boris a sound thrashing at this election, so he can say, well, he's not particularly popular and all that. He blew it. And yet they're throwing money at Boris to try and get him through this and get him elected. Because what they don't want is a mayor that might take them to court when you make unfair cuts. And I think councils missed out on this. When you looked at how the cuts fell on councils, the average Labour council had an 8% cut in government grant, the average Tory council 4%, and some Tory councils actually had an increase in government grant. And I think if I'd been mayor, we'd have looked for a legal challenge against all of that. I made it clear because I supported the campaign to keep my local library open at Cricklewood. I didn't agree with the Labour group decision on that. I'd actually be very tempted to say, I can see areas where you make cuts in council spending, with bloody contracts for lopping the trees, which I think is driven by lawyers worrying about, legal challenges from someone about subsidence and tree roots. I want to see the trees providing more shade, not always pared back to an ugly bloody skeleton every couple of years and so on. So there are things you could cut. But I will give that leadership insofar as I can. I have to say as well, and it leads on to the next question, I don't think we're really asking you to vote second preference for Labour. We're saying you vote second preference for me. It's not a blanket endorsement of what the Labour Party is doing. You're making a choice between me and Boris Johnson. Good or evil, Darth Vader or Luke Skywalker. Darth Vader came all right at the end, didn't he? So I don't ask you to endorse the Labour Party.
Just on that very point though, we did endorse you for second preference last time round, and we're clear we were endorsing you rather than the Labour Party. But your colleagues in the Labour Party often didn't see it that way. Brighton Labour, for example, put out loads of newsletters saying Greens are saying it's a waste of time voting Green, you might as well vote Labour. That went out across Brighton. We had your Assembly candidates, Labour Assembly candidates, also making the same point about the Assembly elections, saying it's the Greens are basically given up and saying you might as well vote Labour and spinning it that way. How do you try and rein in some of your party colleagues from making wildly inaccurate statements about a principal decision that this party might take?
I can't stop. No one can stop me making wildly inaccurate statements. How can this be any? You say what you think. I have never tried. When I was leader of the GLC, we did not have this awful central discipline that has become part of British politics. I chose Val Shawcross to be my deputy mayor. She said, when Kevin talked to me about it, what will happen if I disagree? I said, go ahead and say it. I've never accepted that ridiculous idea you've got to follow a rigid party line, and I don't expect anybody else to.
So in that spirit of independent-mindedness then, if some of your colleagues talk utter shit about the second preference deal, And if
Well,
we
no,
do
they're
that,
not.
would
They're gonna be delighted.
would you publicly
No
pull them up
one, no
on that?
Labour candidate is going to oppose me saying use your second preference for the Green, or oppose you using them for me. You may have lots of rows with them afterwards, but
But what if they try and spin it that it's also
During the
a
election.
general endorsement for Labour across all of the
I'll
ballots?
make it clear it isn't. You know, I mean, I'm sure it's all on record there anyhow. I mean, you are making a choice between Boris Johnson and me, and frankly, I mean, Boris Johnson is, you know, he stopped being a climate change denier, but he's actually done bloody nothing actually to tackle climate change problems. There couldn't be a clearer choice if you're Green in any of this. But also I have to say, I mean, I'm not at all surprised Brighton Labour Party, facing losing, was trying to pretend there's no chance of Caroline winning. But I'm delighted Caroline's a member of Parliament. She played an absolutely excellent role. I can't see any real difference in her politics and mine. I think there is a huge overlap between the progressive Labour wing of Labour and the Greens. And that's what's important. I mean, New Labour is dead. That's why we elected Ed Miliband. That election came down, I mean, literally, in the same way that my contest for the Labour nomination between me and Una King, back in 2010, in the aftermath of that debate, both Miliband's election and mine were a firm rejection of the New Labour stuff. And, you know, I always say, just sail on in that very different direction. When I meet Ed Miliband, I have to say, Ed Miliband, for the first time in 30 years, as a leader of the Labour Party, invites me round for dinner, so he must be going in the right direction. The rest wouldn't have given me a sandwich if I'd been dying of starvation. And then we come to the rights. I mean, it was just so clear to me. Whilst you had all this nonsense, people saying, oh, it's just criminality and all that, that it's exactly parallel what happened in 1981. You were 2 years into a quite reactionary government making savage attacks on benefits, public services, unemployment soaring, and an arrogant elite completely out of touch, as Thatcher was and the ministers around Teddy, with what's happening on the street. And then you had the spark of, ignited by a police action. In Brixton in 81, it was really heavy-handed police because they were stopping young black men 2 or 3 times a week each. They called it Operation Swamp. They saw themselves as keeping the black community in its place, and it sparked riots then spread throughout the country. And this time you had the shooting of Mark Duggan. And I mean, what I would have done differently, as Mark Duggan's parents marched to Tottenham Court, to Tottenham Police Station, I would have been there to meet them. And when we had the accidental shooting, mistaken shooting, the John Charles Domenis, I was straight onto radio and TV apologising, admitting this was a mistake, it shouldn't have happened, there'd be a full inquiry, if necessary there'd be prosecutions. We put a senior assistant commissioner on a plane to go and apologise to his parents. Here there was nothing. The parents got there, they waited for hours, there was no one to meet them. There wasn't a commissioner, there wasn't a mayor. And that, I think, was what turned the anger from something that could have been contained. And that's the role I play as mayor. I wouldn't have done what Boris Johnson did. I'm not coming home to reward the rioters. You want to be in the city when things are going wrong, just as you want to be in the city when they're going right. And I think the fact that poor people will see in City Hall there's a mayor representing the vast majority, and in particular the poorest and the excluded, may help reduce the risk of those riots, because we'll be focusing on what we can do, what are the policies we can bring forward to try and make life a bit more tolerable. That's why, it can be quite boring looking at the detail of what's in my manifesto. It's all the small things we do with the new energy co-op, insulation, restoring the EMA, all relatively small sums of money for each individual, but together helping the poorest people just about get through this period.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions then. So I'll see Natalie at the back, and then Stephen halfway down, and the chap with the blue shirt.